Hello and welcome to this Unit 6 video lecture. This is the second of two lectures on the Pentekontaetia, the 50 years spanning the end of the Persian Wars to the onset of what will be known as the Great Peloponnesian War. In the last lecture, we saw how in Athens, domestic policies and foreign policy overlapped with one another. We saw how, as the Persian threat diminished, the belief that Sparta was a looming threat to Athenian greatness became the dominant perception in the minds of many Athenian politicians, certainly those political figures labeled radical Democrats. The Spartans also developed a heightened suspicion of Athens and its motives and actions. And of course, Pericles, the leading radical Democrat, did nothing to allay Spartan fears. Indeed, immediately after Chimon's exile, Pericles maneuvers the Athenian assembly into creating alliances with Thessaly and, more importantly, with Argos, located on the Peloponnese. And when it is seen by the Spartans that the radical Athenian Democrats are meddling in the Peloponnese, that really does set off alarm bells back in Sparta. And what will further set the two sides on the course for conflict is when the keenly important city-state of Megara, which is situated on a land bridge that connects the Attic Peninsula with the Peloponnese, when Megara falls into the Athenian sphere of influence. Traditionally, Megara was a critically important for the Spartans because Sparta needed access to Megara in order to project Spartan power into regions other than the Peloponnese. Remember, the Spartans had no real navy to speak of, and if they needed to maneuver their ground forces into the mainland, or at least have the ability to keep Athens in line, they would have to march through Megaran territory and cross through some mountain passes. Well, stasis became a problem in Megara, and a democratic faction within Megara seized control of the entire polis and immediately signed an alliance with the Athenians, agreeing to close off access to those mountain passes should the Spartans ever decide to threaten Athens. And this, from the Spartan perspective, is intolerable. So Sparta declares war on Athens, and this war will run hot and cold for about 16 years. The Spartans will rely on ground power, and the Athenians will rely on naval power. And the Athenians are able to capture the island of Aegina off the coast of the Attic Peninsula, which had been a Spartan ally. And the Athenians will also move to the north into the area of Boeotia and attempt to expand Athenian power in that region. Things then kind of plod along for a few years without any major battles, and the Athenians begin to feel rather confident that not only can they manage the Spartans, but they can even expand their role in the Aegean. So the Athenians give into that impulse we have been tracking through much of this course, particularly with the Persian kings, the impulse known as Imperial overreach. The Athenians decide to become involved in a foreign venture that is going to cause them to have to split their forces between keeping the Spartans at bay while taking on a new adversary. And the new adversary will be the Persian Empire. You see, shortly after the outbreak of the First Peloponnesian War, a Delian League fleet is going to land in Egypt, which had been a Spartan province, but the Egyptians had revolted, and the Delian League, i.e. Athens, decided that now is a good opportunity to peel away Egypt from the Persian Empire. The Delian League sends forces, mainly Athenian, to help the Egyptian rebels win their independence. And although this is a major long-term commitment of forces, things initially are going well, but in 454, the Persians are able to launch a counteroffensive, retake Egypt, and they wind up capturing and destroying a sizable Delian League force. And by sizable, I mean in excess of 100 triremes. Shortly after this disaster, the Persians regained control of Egypt. Now, the Athenians, recognizing that this type of setback could cause the Delian League members to revolt against Athenian political leadership, they decide that they need control of the financial assets of the Delian League. So Pericles says that, Delos is too close to Egypt, and now that the Persians have reestablished themselves in Egypt, the island of Delos is too dangerous a place to keep all the league's silver. So we should move the treasury to a more secure location. How about Athens? And of course, the Delian League members are not happy about this, but they are not yet in a position to stand against Athenian authority. Now, in 449, we see that the Athenians are really feeling the pressure of waging a low-intensity war in Greece that occasionally turns hot or high intensity, while also committing resources to making sure that the Persian resurgence only extends to Egypt and doesn't result in the Persians getting any grand ideas about moving back into the Aegean. So Pericles negotiates what becomes known as the Peace of Callias. Callias was the Athenian diplomat who actually did the negotiations with the Persians. And this peace, the Peace of Callias, officially ends hostilities between Greek and Persian in 449 BCE. And then in 446 BCE, the Spartans and the Athenians are able to negotiate a peace treaty when Pericles and the Spartan king Plastionix come to an agreement. And this will result in what should have been a 30 years peace, but as we'll see, it won't last half that long. Now that all these conflicts are settled, the Athenian leadership looks to enhance their own domestic agenda, and that domestic agenda is going to be shaped by Pericles. And I should mention that the source of Pericles' political power was his ability to get elected time and time again to the board of 10 generals. You may remember that the traditional political office of archon had been the highest office in the land. It was the highest elective office in the land, but the radical Democrats were able to change that office from an elective office to an office chosen by lot, by lottery. And so, consequently, that office loses its luster and its political power, and it will be the board of generals, strategoi as they were called, that will form the executive branch of the Athenian government. Because even though the generals were there on hand to serve during times of conflict, they also held enormous influence whenever they spoke in front of the assembly. So, it was by consistently being re-elected to that position as general that allowed Pericles to dominate Athenian political life for decades. Now, how did he do it? How did he get elected time and time again to this board of generals? Well, he could always rely on the electoral support of the Thetes. As we have seen, the Thetes have followed that path that we have discussed earlier, where if you have a social class that shows up on the battlefield, that social class will gain greater political influence. We saw how the hoplite class was able to do this during the Archaic Age and beyond. And now, with the battles at Salamis, at Mycale, at the Eurymedon River, and the maintenance of the Delian League fleet, the Thetes, who are the rowers of these triremes, really do begin to assert themselves politically. And they are led in many ways by Pericles, who convinces them that he has their best interests at heart and that they should continue to support him. And of course, for the Thetes, their interests are closely aligned with the maintenance and even the expansion of the Delian League, because it is the League dues, those contributions by the League members, that are paying the salary of these Thete rowers. So Thetes will always favor a policy of continued imperialism, because at this point it is evident to everybody that with the peace of Callias that ends hostilities between Greek and Persian, the Delian League may not really be necessary as an anti-Persian alliance. But it certainly is necessary to sustain the Athenian economy and to continue the expansion of the Athenian democracy. So how exactly did these policies, foreign policy and domestic policy, overlap? Well, for Pericles and for the Thetes, the maintenance of the Delian League was an absolute necessity, because the League dues paid the salaries not only of substantial numbers of rowers in the Athenian navy, but also for those Thetes who were getting a little older and could not find work as rowers. Well, they could serve now in political offices and on juries, and they could draw a salary for their service. This was something new that Ephialtes and Pericles and the other radical Democrats had proposed. Prior to this, if you served in an office or on a jury in one of the law courts, you would not be paid because your service was considered part of your civic responsibilities. But the problem was that serving in an office, which could last for months, or on a jury, which could last for weeks, that took you away from your place of employment, and you're going to lose money. Now, if you're an aristocrat, that's no problem. You've got the wealth, so you can absorb those losses. But for everybody else, it was a financial hardship to be a full participatory member of the Athenian democracy. So the salaries instituted by the radical Democrats helped to defray the costs of holding offices and serving on juries. Additionally, the Delian League contributions will be used to finance the rebuilding of Athens. Remember, when the Persians had occupied Athens in 480, they had burned much of the city to the ground. So the Athenians have to reconstruct their city, and as the Delian League dues begin to pour into Athens, this presents an opportunity to rebuild on a far grander scale. There is, after all, after defeating the Persians, there is a palpable feeling of Athenian pride, and the idea is to rebuild the city in a way that would showcase the increasing fortunes of a victorious superpower. And of course, this will require lots of resources and a workforce, and we can see that these public works projects are going to employ many poor Athenians as artisans and craftsmen and laborers. So to finance these building projects, ultimately the Delian League dues become absolutely necessary. So we can see that the Delian League contributions, which were supposed to be exclusively for the maintenance of military assets necessary to keep the Persians out of the Aegean, those contributions have now found their way into all sorts of Athenian domestic expenditures. And finally, to defray the high costs of grain, subsidized grain that is, which had to be brought in from some of the soil-rich areas of the broader Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, this will become the new priority of the Delian League. To make sure that grain from the Greek colonies that are ringing the Black Sea region, well, make sure that these grain shipments from these colonies can make it safely through the Bosporus and down the Hellespont and into Athens itself. So to keep these choke points open and the seas under Athenian control, that becomes the new mission of the Delian League Navy. So we see that Pericles has created this patronage machine that will guarantee his political fortunes, but along the way, this merger of foreign and domestic policies will undoubtedly benefit the poorer Athenians, particularly the Thete class. There is a question, though, as to whether this expansion of Athenian democracy and the expansion of the Athenian economy is based on the exploitation of their fellow Greeks, i.e., the Delian League members. So grumblings and criticisms among the Delian League members begin to become more vociferous because, of course, in 449, the Peace of Callias had been signed, and according to the terms of this peace treaty, the Greeks would not sail out of the Aegean and attack any of the Persian provinces that were along the eastern Mediterranean coastline, particularly Phoenicia. And in return, the Persians agreed that they would never, ever again encroach upon the Ionian Greek areas. And so it seems that the Persian threat has been neutralized, and Pericles knows that the logical question is, well, why the heck do we need a Delian League if the main threat has been decisively vanquished? So Pericles decides to summon a Grand Hellenic League conference, just as the Greeks did back in 481, on the eve of Xerxes' invasion of Greece, when the Hellenic League was first formed. Well, technically, the Hellenic League is still in place, and Pericles wants to address the future of the Delian League, and he also wants to throw in some other wider Greek affairs, but none of the other city-states chooses to respond to this invitation, especially the Spartans, who say to themselves, we're not going to let this Athenian summon us. Who does he think he is? And this is probably something Pericles anticipated. With no other independent Greek polis there to raise objections, Pericles can announce that the Delian League must continue and that the League treasury, which is now in Athens, would be used to reconstruct the monuments that had been destroyed by the Persians. And of course, the monuments that will be reconstructed first are going to be those in the city of Athens. And now we start to see the construction of that great architectural wonder of the world, the Parthenon, which sits atop the Athenian Acropolis. So with this public announcement, the veneer is torn away from the perception of the Delian League as an anti-Persian alliance, and now everybody, including the Athenians, fully recognizes that the League has become an Athenian empire. So a multitude of construction projects in Athens either begin or continue apace. The Parthenon will take about 12 years to build, and it will stand as an incredibly elegant monument to Athenian greatness. Another major construction project that will play a role in future events is the building of what were called the Long Walls, which will connect the city of Athens with its main port, called the Piraeus. Earlier Athenian leaders, most notably Themistocles, had advocated the fortification of Athens by building walls around the city. What Pericles wants to do is build walls 8 miles from Athens to the Piraeus, so 8 miles connecting Athens to its port. He wants a secure conduit by which those grain ships can arrive in port, and that grain can be hauled up to the city of Athens and distributed to the population. And we must recognize here the budding of an idea that Pericles may have to make Athens siege-proof. Again, Pericles recognizes that the Persians are out of the picture, and it will be the Spartans who will likely be the big threat to Athenian supremacy. And the Spartans are a land power, and if you can somehow make Athens siege-proof, then you will guarantee that the Athenians can withstand any assault by the Spartans or any other hostile land power. So the creation of these long walls becomes a key point of the public works projects that will be financed by Delian League silver. And the issue of the growing restlessness of many, not all, but many, Delian League members is going to play a key role in future events, as we'll see in upcoming lectures.